Illich's stress on individuality is almost a stress on hyper-individuality. In my sense is, of course, people, critics, oftentimes associate individuality with the liberal, democratic, parliamentary consensus. Of course, I tend to, when I look at the kind of incipient utopianism in Illich's work, I see some connection between his notion of individualism and Marx's notion of freely associated labor. And I'm just wondering what the reaction to that might be. Now, how does this concept of decommodification fit into a larger pedagogy of liberation? And I think that was something that I was provoked to ask when Doug was reading. I think Carlos answered that question to a certain extent by talking about the limitations of Illich's overall sort of problematic. I mean, in a sense, he really was a pilgrim of the obvious. He was a kind of radical monk. And he really didn't seem to have a larger sort of political project other than to sort of critique, the excesses of what had already transpired, both in terms of society, culture, etc., politics, etc. So my question would be, what do you think Illich's vision of social transformation, his larger vision, was? What were the essential differences, just as kind of a summary, between Ivan Illich and Freire? It's interesting because when I was a graduate student in Toronto in 1979, I recall, 1979 to about 1982, I recall many discussions about Illich and Freire was always singled out. Now beyond the obvious answer that educators were more invested in Freire, because if they were invested in Illich, they'd be out of a job, obviously. What were the essential differences between Freire and Ivan Illich? And Freire has also been critiqued or challenged on the question of whether or not he was really a pedagogue post-revolution or pre-revolution. So the critique has largely been Freire was a pedagogue after the revolution. I'm thinking of pedagogy first. To what extent did he join Ivan Illich, if at all, in that perspective? Now, I'm just going to stop here in a moment, but I wanted to comment a little bit on Illich's connection with Hugh. You mentioned the same. And I actually have a little bit of a quotation. Hugh, what was it? Hugh, what was his full title? Hugh of... Yes. And he wrote this, and he was on Jerry, this is actually taken from an interview with Jerry Brown in 1996. And they spent a lot of time, Jerry Brown and Ivan Illich, talking about love. And Illich, Brown began to read this letter. And Illich decided to finish the letter for Jerry Brown. And it started like this. To my dear brother, this is the goodly saint speaking here. To my dear brother Rinaldi, from Hugh, a sinner. Love never ends. When I first heard this, I knew it was true. But now, dearest brother, I have the personal experience of fully knowing that love never ends. For I was a foreigner. I met you in a strange land. But that land was not really strange, for I found friends there. And Illich interrupts Brown and says, it's so beautiful. This is during the radio broadcast. And Brown actually continues. And he says, but the land was not really strange, for I found friends there. I don't know whether I first made friends or was made one, but I found love there, and I loved it. And I could not tire of it, for it was sweet to me. And I filled my heart with it. And it was sad that my heart could hold so little. I could not take in all that there was, but I took in as much as I could. I filled up all the space I had, but I could not fill in all. I found so I accepted what I could and weighed down with this precious gift. I didn't feel any burden because my heart sustained me. And now, having made a long journey, I find my heart still warm, and none of the gift has been lost, for love never ends. And then Illich breaks in and goes, isn't that a marvelous little letter? And Illich decides to respond to this. And he said, this is Yvonne Illich, that I cannot come to be fully human unless I have received myself as a gift and accepted myself as a gift of somebody who has. Well, today we say distorted me the way you distorted me by loving me. Now, friendship in the Greek tradition, in the Roman tradition, in the old tradition, was always viewed as the highest point which virtue can reach. Virtue, meaning here the habitual facility of doing the good thing, which is fostered by what the Greeks called politia, political life, community life. I know it was a political life in which I wouldn't have liked to participate. This is what I find very interesting in his response. With the slaves around, with the women excluded, but I still have to go to Plato or to Cicero. They conceived of friendship as a flower, a supreme flowering of the interaction which happens in a good political society. This is what makes long experience so painful with you, that every time we are together, you make me feel most uncomfortable about my not being like you. I know it's not my vocation, it's your vocation. Structuring community and society in a political way, but I do not believe that friendship today can flower out, can come out of political life. And he goes on to say this, but I do believe if there was something like a political life to remain for us in this world of technology, then it begins with friendship. So he's basically saying that love cannot come out of a political community, but a political community could only come out of love. And then he ends by saying, therefore, my task is to cultivate discipline, self-denying, careful, tasteful friendships. Mutual friendships always, I and you, and I hope a third one, out of which perhaps community can grow. Because perhaps here we can find what the good is. To make it short, while once friendship in our Western tradition was the supreme flower of politics, I do think that a community like, if it exists today at all, it is in some way the consequence of friendship cultivated by each one who initiates it. This, of course, is a challenge to the idea of democracy, which goes beyond anything which people usually talk about, saying each one of you is responsible for the friendships he or she can develop, because society will be as good as the political result that these friendships will be. So it's interesting, because on the one hand, I would like to compare this to, and I'm not going to, I'm going to ask the presenters today if they could elaborate a little bit on this, about that concept of friendship grounded in love, the notion of community grounded in love. What comparisons or differences might Illich's perspective play out with Freire's notion, or the notion of, we all know, Che Guevara, for instance. So, here are three very different figures who have all talked about the centrality of love. And what are the differences that might obtain among these three personages? Now, it suggests to me that Illich really, in some fundamental way, focused on a kind of ethics. The world was grounded in ethics. Marx, of course, we know in some ways, disdained the concept of ethics to a certain extent. He was basically focusing on relations of production, the economic organization, out of which could follow the possibility of community. The possibility of community did not exist unless the social relations of production were such that alienated labor would not, be able to exist. Illich seems to be grounded in the concept of love. He almost takes the reverse notion that only a society can only grow and flourish if we begin with the principle of love. Two very different emphases, and I'm just curious to know what our presenters would think about that.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. I don't know how to proceed, because Peter raised a host of extraordinary good questions. He added his own interpretation, which I concur, on a number of facets of Illich. We have many things on the table. Maybe, Douglas, you would like to respond in principle. I could do something like that. in principle as well when we open up our conversation with all of us Illich, because Illich gave us more than just food for thought, gave us some indications of how to educate, and I think it's an interesting way to do it.
Okay, actually both Peter and Carlos in their presentations answered or clarified a question that was sort of going in my mind, and that was, what are the differences between Paulo Freire and Ivan Illich, as well as what is the kinship and the similarities. And I thought that both Peter and Carlos helped me sort of see the differences, with Illich being more sort of monastic, more sort of a Christian communitarian, more of wanting his alternative to come out of communities of friendship and love, and Paulo Freire being more of an activist, more of someone involved in political communities that involve projects like reforming the state, actually developing alternative systems of education in Brazil. Carlos has written books about that. I would argue, though, that we don't need to do either or, but if we could combine both of these sorts of projects, we would be, get further ahead. And also, as a response to Carlos, in other words, I'm suggesting a dialectical mediation and synthesis. I thought Paulo Freire, in some ways, was being unfair in criticizing Ivan Illich for not seeing the foundation of the bourgeois capitalist education system, that they're schools of ideology. I think that they're both instruments to reproduce industrial society through the hidden curriculum. And I agree with Peter that this phrase that's used by many different people, I found it in rereading Ivan Illich. I'd forgotten myself, where it had come from. But this book that was written in the late 60s and early 70s, the Deschooling Society, analyzed how the structure or the form of schools, like the architecture of schools and the organization according to periods and subjects, etc. And so I would basically argue it's the form and the content of schools that basically reproduces, both in terms of social relations and in terms of ideology, and it's combining both of these to critique schooling that is the important contribution, but also for the alternatives that we both need to figure out how we can have sort of alternative education institutions that are communities, like the Paulo Freire Institute, but also how we can reconstruct, the bigger institutions, whether it's UCLA or public schools, or, develop alternatives on all of these levels. So I thought that the differences were, productively presented in your presentations, and that our challenge is the mediation, and the synthesis.
I agree. I think it occurs to me that this experience of getting two different forces together in the same environment, inviting our third distinguished professor to join us to inspire some commentaries, the idea of creating the Paulo Freire Institute as a site of political activism, as a site of research, as a site of community gathering of sorts, are all initiatives that pertain to the richest tradition of academia, which is this notion of sponsoring curiosity. We could not develop serious scholarship if we are not curious. And I think, in a sense, Freire defined himself as a very curious child when he was young, asking questions around his parents, better to himself. Illich himself defined himself as a very curious individual, and in many different ways, the geniality of Illich let him go to many places. He was extremely conversant of languages, of histories, of stories. He was very conversant of technologies. He was very conversant of different service industries. In a way, his mind never ceased to jump from one area to another area trying to figure out what really the great contribution to conviviality was all about. So he created in broad strokes a set of challenges to himself and to many others that tried to follow him. Freire, in many different ways, concentrated on education, first on adult education, then on education in general. At the same time, he was an activist, and Freire was politically very astute. I think the way we read this criticism of Illich is in a code. The code I would use is the code of political mobilization. Because if you really think of conscientization schooling as a continuum, one thing is, well, we become cognizant of the fact that schools reproduce inequalities. We become cognizant of the fact that social reproduction occurs every day in the schools. We become cognizant of the fact that culture has inscripted in its main rules, rituals, and knowledge. There is hegemony. Therefore, what we need to do is to abandon the school, de-schooling. But at the same time, we have to kind of drop out of society in different ways, because the school is really a negative rather than a plus in the context of the construction of conviviality. Freire would say, no, of course not. First of all, if you drop out from the school, as many Freireans themselves understood in the past, you will leave the floor open. That is the interesting and tricky element, because if the left does not occupy spaces or fight for spaces, not that occupy, because we usually lose many fights, but the question is that you occupy spaces by fighting for those spaces, by stating an element which I would never deny as central in our life, which are principles. You fight for principles. And from principles, you develop strategies and tactics, not the other way around. The difference between an ethical, political, pedagogical thinking is that you start from principles and work around strategies or tactics, or have to implement those principles in the best effective, loving way. So principle precludes you from using some tactics. Principle precludes you from employing some strategies. In a way, Freire is saying, look, this is a strategic question here. If the school is a site of contestation, let's fight it. Don't drop out. In that context, I see the kind of criticism of Illich. Let me finish, because Peter excited me so much with those questions, and of course, there are many other questions, even one interesting question by Douglas here, why Freire become the guru of the left in education, and Illich, who in many different ways said at the same time had more currency in the 70s than Freire, many different ways, kind of disappear and vanish from sight. One answer could be the notion of system. If you keep pondering and pondering and pondering and pondering, maybe your voice will be heard. If you keep working in education like Freire did, then you remain. Another thing is the joyful presence of Freire. Freire was always very joyful. He was a man who enjoyed a meal with his friends, right? Which I bet Illich did as well. But Illich had this kind of somber personality at the outset, which Freire did not. I think the other element in Freire, that Freire was always politically astute. I think Illich was intellectually astute. Illich was very clear and identified where the critique ought to be placed. And he was very clear and defined how to build some kind of utopia around principles that could be articulated. But he had never had an interest of carrying out in the creation of social movements, in the creation of some kind of networking around it. Let me put it this way. Illich built personal friendships. Freire built social movements friendships, and developed schools of thought, and intervened, as he said to me once, I want to invite you to do good things. If I'm excused to do good things, I go there. Even sometimes at the risk of traveling too much for a man who will be older and older. So I think the importance of Illich in the history of thought is still to be assessed critically and connected with Foucault, connected with Freire, connected, particularly connected with the critical theory approach a la Frankfurt, and mostly the idea of culture in the Frankfurt school. There you have an interesting subject. It's well treated and well articulated for a PhD dissertation. On the other hand, I think the legacy of Freire is much easier to appreciate because you have Freireans working in the schools of education, you have Freireans working in other areas, you have people who have been influenced by Freire writing books expanding upon some of the key issues of Freire. But with this I will conclude. I think the element that articulates a lot of our comments today, and it's an element that we take for granted when we have it and we miss and we suffer what we don't, which is love. We have to protect when we have love, our love and our loved ones. Because in a way, the notion of friendship, it is the connection with love. There are different types of love. There is the paideia love, in which teachers love their students. Because we do this as a work of love. We love our students. That's now the notion of loving your children, because it's a different type of love. Then loving your friends, who are neither your children nor your students. It's a different type of love. And when I get too romantic and too sad, I tell particularly my undergraduate students, look at who is with you now. Because 20 years from now, you may be looking backwards and seeing who has walked with you the same way, who has supported you, who has swooped in life, who has been able to console you, to support you, to make you laugh. And I think that friendship is what it is all about. But then, of course, you have to keep in mind this notion of love, which is also pedagogical and political at the level of the couple, at the level of the significant order. At that fairly peculiar one-to-one interaction, the sense of love that we're talking about here is almost germinal to the notion of love that we can speak when we talk about, in the feminist tradition, the notion of caring. The feminists have taught us, and we have learned, I hope, that rather than asking how are you, is what are you going through? The notion of what are you going through is really asking what is a sense of love and sharing the situation, the emotion, the experience. I think in both cases, Freire and Illich, in different angles and different perspectives, with tremendous intelligence, both of them, have contributed to our understanding of love. Illich, maybe in the monastic tradition, Freire more in the jovial Latin American tradition, which is usually much more easygoing and engaging in many different ways than the monastic tradition. But if we draw from both of them, I think we'll be able to learn a great deal. And particularly when we are down, when we are sad, or we have lost hope, think of these guys. Illich spent his life preaching to the winds, being constantly unrecognized because he was ahead of his time. When he spoke, no one understood. He was ahead of his time. Freire spoke and spoke and spoke, and he was condemned as an Christian, as a communist, as a traitor to his land. He was, because of his nationality, he couldn't talk daily in the streets in Portuguese because he was exiled. You know, I mean, these guys, in their own lived experience, show that love could be conquered, that freedom could be conquered. And I think that is a message that comes in looking backward to the history of Illich and Freire in this context of human power. And I think what we should do is open up the conversation. We have plenty of time. If there is any subject or comment or suggestion or your own reading of Freire and Illich, to be very illustrative for us.
I pose a question to you, Carlos, actually that Peter raised, that I would like to have some discussion on, and that's the relation between Illich and Marx. We've all made the point that even Illich's critique of industrial society was similar to the Frankfurt school, showing how all of the institutions of the factory, of schooling, of the state, produce certain forms of alienation and oppression, and other forms of technological rationality and bureaucracy produce these. So Illich shares this general critique. Carlos pointed out, and Peter also, the sort of Catholic monastic roots of some of Ivan Illich's critique. But Carlos, maybe you can comment on the question Peter raised on how does this relate to classical Marxism. There's very little reference to Marx in those two books, at least, that I reread, Reschooling Society and the Tools of Conviviality. Although he does say at one point that education for socialism requires these tools of conviviality. So he seems to be in something of a leftist framework, but I'm not sure exactly how to situate him versus vis-a-vis classical Marxism. Do you have some thoughts on it?
I don't really have a lot of thoughts. So I have a hunch, which is probably this. On the one hand, he was training in very classical philosophy and theology in the Gregorian University, which is probably one of the places you will find a great deal of Marx. And you really think that he was really trained before the Second Vatican Council, so he didn't have readily access to the Marxist tradition, no matter how important it was at the time in Europe. On the other hand, I will bet that he was very concerned with what I would call the young Marx notion of manuscripts, the economic philosophical manuscript, in which Marx, 1848, really draw the whole argument and expand upon the argument of 1845 on the German ideology on alienation. I think that if there is a clear connection between critical theory, Marx, and Illich, is to the Marxist concept of alienation, which goes beyond the Hegelian concept of objectification. And certainly is very different than some of the concept of exploitation developed by the French socialists, the utopian socialists that Marx criticized. So my hunch is that if there is any source of thinking for Illich in the early stages, because he's a socialist, but he is a cosmogenic socialist. He's a kind of a theoretic cosmogenic socialist. You think of socialism at the global scale. You know, one of the things that I miss in this conversation, and I wish I could find an answer, or someone can find an answer, what Illich said about globalization. Because, I mean, he was really anticipating globalization earlier than anybody else. So what is his assessment of globalization from this kind of critique of alienation?
I think he has a critique of industrial civilization as globalized. It's destroying Europe. I mean, he certainly had the ecological critique. It's using up the resources of the earth. It's causing pollution. It's producing overpopulation. So I think he has a completely globalizing critique of industrial civilization. That he sees that it is encompassing the earth and that it is destroying the earth. So that's a critique of globalization. But I think you're also right. He has this sort of Christian globalizing notion of wanting to have a universal community. That the only way to end industrial civilization is to get the whole world sort of united in some sort of community of learning, of emancipation, of democratization, of social justice, etc. But I think he might have become pessimistic that once the 60s movements were defeated, he sort of turned more into the monastery, so to speak, into small communities of learning and friendship. And that was, I think, Peter's critique, but I swear, despite all the defeats of the left, we always go out and, go to the next country and connect with the next movement and, involve himself more in political activism and struggle. But I think that clearly Illich was a globalizer in terms of a critique, of capitalist industrial globalization.
I was interested to mention Pierre Tyrell, because I was actually politicized by the Vatican. To what extent his religious beliefs went through some kind of modification or transformation. We're always very interested in religion, it's really difficult to divorce that from context. People want to know about Marx, religion, etc. It's a key concept. We talked about, in a very general way, Illich is sort of, aesthetically drawn to the monastic tradition, but to what extent, what were his religious beliefs? I'm curious. I don't really know.
I'm going to let Carlos answer this, but I'm just going to make one comment before. Both Carlos and Peter stress very strongly the sort of religious, Catholic roots of both Illich and Paulo Freire, which oftentimes are overlooked. I mean, in discussing both of these figures, sometimes people just put aside, the religious roots and dimension of these thinkers, which would be the difference from Marx, that is a more secular, enlightenment critic of religion. But I think it's clear that for both Freire and Illich, religion is playing a much bigger role in the Concord School, in Foucault, and many people in Marxist tradition. So you have some thoughts on Illich's religious beliefs, and there's quite a bit of the history of his interaction with the Catholic Church, often very conflicted. But what do you think he finally might have believed or taken with him as his sort of religious underpinnings or ultimate beliefs?
Maybe a comment on Marx. Everybody knows that he trained in philosophy with a thesis on the difference in the philosophy of Korean and Marxism, which is really too materialistic in the sort of prescribed. And the first job that he started almost a thing was to teach theology in the same university, if I'm not mistaken, in Berlin, maybe Bonn, where he was a great deal of the leftist Hegelians who were all convinced that theology had to be used for the purpose of advancement of socialism. He didn't get it back. But could you imagine if Marx would have turned a professor of theology in Bonn, whether he would have cut it that right? That's kind of wrong. This is a parallel with Freire, I say, because when Freire wrote his dissertation at the time in Brazil, where we talk about that today, we have no formal studies. So what he did, he applied for a job as a university professor. And to apply for a job, you have to present your vita, you have to really write a dissertation, defend your dissertation in a public examination in front of a jury. The jury then to see whether you have been habilitated, whether you are able to teach. And the first year, then you are appointed professor. The second year, you are given full habilitation, authorized to teach as a full professor. He won, he did that, he passed all the examination and so on, but he didn't get the job. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Freire did the job of professor. He may have been somebody like us discussing somebody else's ideas. All right. Now, I don't know what Illich, in the end, when he was dying, believed. I do believe that moment of death, and I've been thinking about this a lot because I reread that particular piece that he received 6 or 7 years before he died, and when he was sick. And at 70, when you get to be 70, you know how many years you have left. So I was thinking of death today, and it's true that in my impression, I always have this impression, that the moment of objectification of life is that moment that you have no more mask to wear, you have no more corners to hide, you have no more truth to tell somebody ever is. So what was Illich believing at the time of his death, or what was Freire believing at the time of his death? I would not know, probably not. But I'm absolutely convinced that when he directed Sidok, he was part of this emerging trend that materialized theology of liberation. And any indication in seeing the writings before and after led me to believe that he was really one of the builders with a very minuscule part of the theology of liberation approach. I have not followed Illich in the 80s and 90s like what he has. He can throw outside, but I have followed some of his writing book, this attempt to mix Eastern and Western philosophy is a very creative approach. So who knows, he may have rethought his own roots as a Catholic.
I think both Berry and Illich have this religious vision that once they have heaven on earth, or wants to realize, the religious community in the here and now, wants social justice, not in heaven in the afterlife, but once, now ready to fight for it. So it's sort of a worldly realization or appropriation of religion, although there are the monastic elements also in Illich that I don't think are incorrect, where there is sometimes a retreat from the world into yourself, maybe to reinvigorate or replenish your spiritual energies.
I would say this. I think it's another religious element that unites both of them is guilt. National guilt. This has more than one theological participation. It's absolutely essential in understanding the Catholic theology. And both of them were individuals who had a tremendous notion of guilt. Guilt as privilege, guilt as success, guilt as being unable to modify this notion of reality. I think that unifies both of them throughout their life. Guilt is quite a feeling in your process of encouraging activism.
Actually, I did a seminar today on Rousseau about how he wrote this great treatise on education and real partly guilt. He hadn't raised his own children that he'd sort of given away because he wasn't married and couldn't really support them, etc. So then he spent all this time and energy figuring out, well, how can I educate children? What is the role of education and parenting, etc. So I think guilt does play an often unrecognized role in intellectual life, but also suffering. I mean, both Illich, which is another Christian sort of motif. I think Rousseau and Illich, Marx and Freire experienced all kinds of suffering where they were thrown out of their countries, or thrown out of the church, or thrown out of the university. Belongings, having all kinds of personal problems, pain and illnesses that they had to deal with. And this was also motivating. Well, how can we create a world that deals with these problems of human suffering and will go after the origins, what caused human suffering in people, and how can we create a world without suffering? So I think this is another experience that's often overlooked in terms of how intellectuals come up with ideas, develop life's work.
Yeah. Well, I think I might have read Illich differently, but from UCLA as an undergrad, and the anarchist activists who I know actually they introduced Illich to me. So that maybe because of this reason, one thing that I think Illich has contributed that very more than very Marx is the anarchistic perspective that he specifically addressed, say, the industrialization of, say, healthcare. Instead of having this modernized healthcare, he specifically talked about people would have control of their own health, hygiene, and things like that, which Marx couldn't follow because you can have a perfectly social society without, and with all the modernist elements still going on. So I think it is the anarchistic or decentralizing critique of Illich author.
Yeah, I think you're right. Carlos mentioned that just as sort of an aside that I think we're missing. You know, in this discussion, sort of very strong anarchistic roots that he, just like Bakunin, just believed the state was evil. You know, there's no way you can reform the state. You had to smash the state. I think there's a part of Illich that, you know, just believes that the modern industrial, you know, institution of schooling is hopelessly evil, and we just have to smash it and develop alternatives. And that's the difference from Paulo Freire, who's not an anarchist. In the way that,
Well, I'm thinking of other anarchists like, well, who described himself as an anarcho-syndicalist, Chomsky. Chomsky's role as a public intellectual was a role I greatly admire. He's been trying to gain the attention of the mass media. Somebody compared, actually, to Chomsky in terms of figures that were once engaged by the mass media briefly and then forgotten. Perhaps they became too dangerous or but Chomsky's role as a public intellectual seems to be much more, over the years, to have been much more vital than Illich's. I'm curious about that.
no, that's just correct. I mean, I get that, but I think this is Illich in the sense that Chomsky and Paulo Freire just went out lecturing all over the world all the time, and public book after book, and cultivated relations with publishers. And Illich did it. He didn't have this, you know, dimension of activism, et cetera. So I think it's a good point that Chomsky and Illich share an anarchist tradition, but Chomsky is much more of a public intellectual figure. I mean, Illich had his time. He was a world-class public intellectual. He went to conferences and lectured and was invited and did make presentations, etc. But he didn't continue it. And then maybe it was partly health reasons too. I don't know. And obviously, as Peter said, he did have, you know, serious health problems through his last decade.
One thing that interests me, without knowing much about Illich, is the fact as a product of the diaspora, as a Michelin king, somebody who would have been totally dislocated by, you know, having a Jewish mother and having a mistake. He resurfaces as a Latin American. And the little thing that Carl said about his choosing in the Upper West Side of New York to the Puerto Ricans rather than the establishment, American establishment. Irish also